Welcome, everyone. It is great to be with you. My name is Taryn, and I'm a manager in the knowledge and technical team at A4S. I'm excited to be here today, co-hosting this webinar. Today, we are talking about aligning sustainability within strategic planning, budgeting, and forecasting, or SPBF. The main focus will be on carbon and how to embed carbon considerations and carbon strategy within wider SPBF processes. Please note we are recording the webinar for others, and it will be made available on the A4S YouTube channel and website later this month. There are 3 learning objectives for this webinar. After completing today's event, you will be able to articulate the business benefits of integrating sustainability into strategic planning, budgeting, and forecasting. Consider how you could apply different budgeting methodologies to help you achieve your organization's strategic sustainability goals, and translate the experience and learning of others through practical examples that will be shared during this webinar to your own work. Please also note that throughout the session, we will be running a few poll questions, which you'll need to complete in order to gain CPE points. The webinar will last around 1 hour. We're going to have a short intro and then head straight into a discussion with our guests to understand the implications for finance teams. There should be some time for Q&A at the end, so please do drop your questions in the chat function, and we'll do our best to answer these. So before we move on to our discussion, I just want to introduce the guests who are joining us today. So we have Annabelle Degroot, who is the Global Finance Sustainable Performance Management Lead at Unilever. She was part of the A4S Academy in 2023, where she led an internal team and collaborated with groups across the business to build a greenhouse gas reduction plan, which enabled 5 business groups to set ambitious 2030 GHG plans. We also have Lizzy Peacock. Lizzy is the VP of Finance in the Supply Chain and Product Division at Burberry. Lizzy was also part of the A4S Academy program in 2023, where she modeled carbon emissions for Burberry's 4-year product strategy. A warm welcome to you both. Before we dive into our panel discussion, we're going to start with a quick overview. Integrating sustainability into strategic planning, budgeting, and forecasting. While some companies focus only on short-term financial gains, leaving sustainability as an afterthought, many are shifting focus toward long-term resilience and are aligning their sustainability strategies and goals with their wider corporate strategy. This not only helps the environment, but can also make business operations more efficient and cost-effective. In order to achieve this alignment, it is important to embed sustainability within strategic planning, budgeting, and forecasting processes to crystallize the actions needed to support the achievement of long-term strategic sustainability goals. Finance professionals play a big role in making this happen, as they tend to be heavily involved in these processes. Through A4S's work with the A4S Academy, we are increasingly seeing finance teams become more integrated with sustainability teams, with increasing levels of collaboration and knowledge sharing between traditional finance and sustainability roles. This is an important element of aligning sustainability and wider corporate strategies, and results in a significant change in the way that finance teams operate. Our speakers today will be providing some insights into how finance teams may need to change the way they approach strategic planning, budgeting, and forecasting. Using carbon budgets for emissions reduction. Many companies are heavily focused on carbon and carbon reductions, and it is useful to mention how carbon budgets can support in achieving decarbonization goals. Carbon budgets are like roadmaps for companies to reduce their carbon footprint. They outline how emissions should be cut and where efforts should be concentrated. Analyzing carbon budgets can also guide the development of eco-friendly policies. Once set, these budgets help track progress and adjust strategies if targets aren't met. There is a lot of useful information on carbon budgeting within our essential guide to strategic planning, budgeting, and forecasting. So if you are looking to put this in place within your organization, that is a good place to start. And we will share this link later in the webinar. Transition planning for sustainability goals. With climate change and biodiversity loss becoming urgent issues, transition planning is crucial. It's like a guide for businesses and financial institutions to move towards sustainability in line with global agreements like the Paris Agreement. This planning ensures a fair transition for everyone while pushing for a low greenhouse gas economy. Initiatives such as the TPT disclosure framework and collaborations like GFANS are gaining momentum, highlighting the importance of climate action and provide useful resources to set out what companies might need to think about when it comes to developing a clear and credible transition plan. Transition planning is designed to translate a decarbonization target into specific actions and objectives, and will require consideration of all areas of the business, from the decarbonization of assets and operations to the shift in products and portfolios to those that align with a low carbon economy. Many companies are currently seeking to develop their transition plans, which can seem like a large and daunting task. However, the shift required to achieve decarbonization will affect many areas of the business, and there are many areas where finance teams can focus their attention to feed into the bigger picture. Today, our speakers will provide us with some practical insights into how they have considered decarbonization goals within their wider strategic planning, budgeting, and forecasting processes. I will now hand over to my colleague Helen for the panel discussion with our speakers.
Thank you, Taryn. Hi, everybody. My name's Helen Wayne, and I'm a Senior Manager in the Knowledge and Learning team at A4S, and I'm delighted to be speaking with our speakers today, starting with Annabelle. So as part of her Academy project, Annabelle looked at how to embed Unilever's GHG emission targets within strategic planning with defined milestones linked to success. So Annabelle, to kick things off, could you elaborate on the initial steps involved in integrating emissions targets into strategic planning?
Well, super. Thank you. And thanks very much for having me today. Well, I think to start off by saying it's a big job. It's a complicated job, but also super interesting. And I think also really important to say is when we started this journey, I almost started with the assumption that everybody knew quite a lot about this area, and soon realized that really, even though, you know, companies like Unilever are sort of been doing this for a long time, there is still a very low level of understanding, particularly in finance teams and across many of the teams, about what actually is this all about. So we very much started with just the basics, Net Zero 101, across the CFOs, the leadership team, and within finance, just to get to the basics of what climate science is, how we measure our emissions, and what SBTi targets are. So that was super important. We then went on to explain the relative difference between scope 1 and 2 and scope 3 targets. You know, everybody's been very focused on scope 1 and 2, and so getting people to really understand just how big and complex scope 3 is also was very, very important. And then we talked about the urgency of reducing emissions now. So yes, okay, you're setting quite long-term targets out in 2030, 2039, etc. But everything we reduce now counts and helps towards that. And so there was a real focus on the urgency to get moving quickly now. Then the next thing was to get leadership buy-in that we actually needed more ambitious targets than we already had. And that's difficult, right? Because we have a number of targets, everybody's trying across a whole range of issues. But understanding the climate science and the need to move to 1.5 degree aligned targets was also a very, very important step. I think then the next big step for the organization was to make sure that it was clear that this just wasn't another sustainability issue coming at them. What we were able to show them was this included everything that we're already doing. So things like deforestation free, we do that for different reasons, but that delivers GHG benefits. Our plastic targets, we're delivering to reduce plastic waste, but that delivers GHG targets. Things like putting energy efficiency into our plants is a cost saving, but it also delivers GHG. So it was really important for the teams to understand that all of this was actually already integrated, and what we needed to do was pull it together to show a total roadmap of how we were going to get there. And then the final step was to help everybody understand that we needed to be very clear about what the costs were involved in these big programs, and making sure that they're visible to the teams and that they're fully integrated into the strategic planning cycle in the same way that we do all our other costs.
Great, thank you. That's a really helpful kind of overview of how to approach this challenge. And you've kind of spoken about the big picture, but then maybe could we elaborate in a bit more depth of taking those large targets and then taking them to the different business units and divisions? How did you kind of collect information in a meaningful way?
Yeah, thank you. Well, Unilever is made up of 5 big business groups, if you like, very specific business groups. There's quite different profiles. You've got things like ice cream, and then we've got things like home care, so quite different. So we work with each of those business groups to help them understand what their emissions are, and most importantly, what their big sources of emissions were. And then we had our science teams start modeling all the different possibilities with them. So a lot of our teams already have GHG reduction plans in place, and ideas of where further reductions can come from. So what we did is we modeled those out to 2030, which is the target year that we set, and just understood what each business group really thinks that they could do. I mean, we challenged it, etc., stretched where we could, but got to a point where each business group said, okay, by 2030, this is what we think we can do. What we had to do with each of them was, help everybody sit with the uncertainty, because a lot of it is unknown and it's modeling, and also sit with the fact that we acknowledge that a lot of the business groups had a gap, that we don't know quite how to get to the 40% or the 42% by 2030, and that's okay, because what we did do is we identified some big priority levers for each of the business groups, and brought the focus back to those priority levers, said, let's focus there. We acknowledge there's a gap, and we've acknowledged that in our transition plan, and we'll work on that later. But let's, in the meantime, really kickstart the action. And I think that really helped our business groups, because net zero is really complex. But if you can say to each business group, you've got 3 or 4 big programs, big priorities to focus on now, let's do that. That's suddenly brought the teams, in line and helped everybody understand what needed to be done. Those priority actions, I guess, form the basis of our transition plan, which has just recently been updated, which people can read. But then that also allowed the teams to then work in the short term. So we said, okay, that's to 2030, right? Okay, what are we going to do for the next 3 years? What are your real priorities for next year? And let's cost those out, work out the costs, get the CapEx, and work with the finance teams to make sure that those numbers are fully embedded in the strategic planning process that was taking place at the time. So I think that that's been a good exercise. And when we did that, the cost exercise and the CapEx exercise, then the business groups actually acknowledged that some of these levers deliver savings. So, dematerialization or changing formulations or energy efficiency actually deliver savings. And that's a much easier story for you to, when you're showing the total picture, to say to the, leadership teams, well, we can see savings coming here, we can see costs there, but it starts to make it all feel much more manageable.
Thank you. Yeah, and it's really, I think those 2 points about kind of managing the uncertainty and becoming comfortable with unknowns is a really important point, especially for finance professionals who are very used to kind of certainty and historic numbers. So thank you for drawing that out. And so going into a bit more depth around the kind of financial planning element. So ensuring that the bottom-up inputs are meaningful involves ensuring that actions taken across the organization and supply chains align with the decarbonisation goals, and that the financial implications of those actions are known. So it's crucial for the product teams, procurement teams, and all of the contributors to that financial plan to really understand the changes that are necessary and the associated costs and benefits. You spoke a little bit about that kind of upskilling, but I wondered if you could expand on how did you kind of ensure that everybody and all contributors to the financial plan had a really clear understanding of what they needed to contribute?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's difficult, right? Because it's such a wide agenda, that, and with such a range of solutions across the business, that the way we manage it at the moment is really those teams that are responsible for delivering that specific lever are the ones that are building the business case and understanding the costs and tracking the costs of each of those levers. So for example, if a business group is doing an innovation, They will be doing an innovation because it's the right thing to do for the consumer. There's a superior product, etc. But it will also be delivering packaging savings, GHG savings, etc. So the GHG element and the plastic element will be costed in as it will be part of the total innovation business case, for which they will track in the normal way through their finance teams. So I guess for us, it's really important that it's not seen as a separate sustainability cost. Many of these programs are part of our overall strategy. They're part of doing day-to-day business, and so we don't have different teams tracking this, if you like. We're trying to get it as integrated as possible. There are some costs that are different. They are genuine investments in the future, things like regenerative agriculture or agreements with companies to look for real alternative materials that are out past 2030, etc. We tend to manage those slightly separately through a climate and nature fund, which just is still costs that are managed by the business, but it just has kind of an extra layer of governance, if you like, and visibility, so that we can understand those costs in more detail. We also have the costs of inaction, if you like, a little bit, which comes through our potential actions or the potential impacts that we have through our TCFD scenario analysis. Those are still very high level, but it allows the teams to look at, okay, well, if we do nothing, what will be the case? And so that helps them sometimes build business cases. But generally, we have the individual teams managing their costs as they go along.
Thank you. And I think that's a really important point, and one kind of making sure that everybody in the organization is pulling together to embed it and integrate it is a really important element, I think, to draw out. And so with the CFOs and finance leaders, it's really important that they can ask the right questions. So how do you make sure that carbon and financial information can be considered together and that it can support leaders in decision making?
Yeah, so we've recently got to the stage now where our CEO and CFO have their monthly performance review with the business groups, where they consider all KPIs, financial, sales, commercial, competition, etc. And we're now at the stage where the progress against our key climate, particularly climate and plastic targets, are considered in the same way in the same meeting. So as a similar score goes in for performance against those metrics each month, and progress against the key actions that we're taking, and then any risks and opportunities, or particularly risks to the delivery of that plan, are highlighted in the same way as risks to delivery of sales, for example, or savings targets might be highlighted. So that is enabling us to accelerate the fact that if for example a capex decision hasn't been made, or funds haven't been allocated, or etc., or business cases are needed, or trade-offs need to be made, then that is being highlighted in that meeting. The good, from a finance point of view, the good thing about that is that scorecard is discussed by the CFO and the BG president with the global CEO, CFO. And so that is naturally meaning that our CFOs are becoming very close to their GHG numbers, plastic targets, etc., and starting to really dig into, okay, those actions and costs, and making sure they understand it so that they can explain it. So it's just getting an extra level of visibility and an understanding that this is totally, and has to be totally, integrated into everything that we do.
Yeah, thank you. Really important, interesting point. Kind of the increased use of information and data does it also kind of increase the awareness and knowledge of what's going on within the business and that oversight. So it's really interesting to hear. Thank you.
Yeah.
So apart from the obvious need to understand how the company needs to change in order to achieve carbon targets, are there any differences in the way that you approach strategic planning for decarbonisation versus how you approach traditional strategic and financial planning? And if so, are there any examples that you could use of kind of how you embed carbon within decision making, for example?
So carbon pricing has been used in CapEx decisions an internal carbon price has been used for scope 1 and 2 CapEx decisions historically at Unilever. The reality of that is that the carbon price compared to the level of investment we're making is often not significant enough to sway a decision. To be honest, that hasn't been a very useful tool. What we are doing now is more formally embedding GHG impact and plastic impact in every innovation decision, and we call it 5S saving program, formally through investor boards, etc. So that is driving our capability to model the impact of innovations on GHG and plastic particularly, and be understood by the wider teams and the finance teams presenting these business cases. So we do it, the strategic planning, the inclusion of these costs is done in the same way as all the others, but what we're doing now is adding that extra layer of understanding GHG impact and plastic impact in more detail in all the innovations. So it has been done and it is done, but slightly on an ad hoc basis. So this is a case of us just making it more formal so that we don't get any surprises where we have innovations that are driving GHG particularly in the wrong direction.
Yeah, really interesting point. And then finally, Unilever's relatively advanced when it comes to this kind of work, but are there any top tips that you could give to wider finance teams who might be at a bit of an earlier stage in their journey?
I think I've learned you've got to keep it super simple. It's a really complex topic, and teams can get sort of, I think, very nervous about the complexity of getting to net zero. And the approach that we've taken is yeah, okay, that's really difficult, but let's focus and identify really on what we can do now and start to accelerate that action, and have teams very, very focused on delivery, and understanding costs now, and different types of teams thinking about the longer term issue. So I think, acknowledging that complexity and trying to keep it simple, really, really important. Starting absolutely with the basics, net zero 101, and making sure that you take everybody on that journey with you, because and don't share some of the other complexity about target setting, etc., with them if necessary. Just keep people very, very focused on the simple stuff. And then with finance people, we have a tendency to want to really understand numbers and be able to measure them exactly and explain variances. I think that's something that I've learned, is that we've all got to get used to the fact that probably our GHG emission numbers are going to go up and down and all over the place, because everything keeps changing and methodologies change, emission factors change. So again, that's something that we're trying to educate the business that probably emissions are going to go up, and while we get these programs moving faster and hopefully then come down, but that there's going to be real fluctuation. And so we're trying to measure people on delivering the actions at the moment rather than on actual GHG numbers. So I think keeping it super simple, but where possible, I guess my final tip is to have finance people involved, because we tend to have the rigor, I guess, and the structure to help with things like performance management and delivery. And so where possible, I would have some finance people involved in the process.
Great, thank you. Really good top tips, and I'm sure they'll be useful to our audience. And thank you so much for the discussion. So we're now going to move on to a discussion with Lizzy Peacock. Welcome.
Thank you.
So at Burberry, one of the key areas of focus for your academy work was to look at product portfolios and to consider how they align with your strategic carbon targets. What made you focus on this area in particular, and how does it fit within the wider work of Burberry on decarbonisation?
So Burberry's committed to reducing Scope 3 emissions by 46% by 2030 and to reach net zero by 2040. And the vast majority of our Scope 3 emissions are coming from our extended supply chain, particularly the raw materials and the creation of the finished goods that we're selling. So it's a real focus area, and it's really critical that we work to reduce our impact. But I think Annabelle already mentioned, compared to Scope 1 and 2, it's also much more complex and a much broader set of stakeholders to look at. So we've already got a number of activities underway that are evolving the key raw materials that we use in our products. The first one, and I guess the one I've been closest to, is the use of responsibly sourced and certified raw materials. So we've set targets to reach 100% certified or responsibly sourced materials in our products by the end of the decade. And these materials often have a lower environmental and carbon impact. So, for example, looking at using recycled fibres or different types of fibres. We've also got some work going on in the product development space in terms of material innovation. So looking at next generation sustainable materials. So an example of this is hydroponic cotton, which is grown through soilless farming in vertical greenhouses, which obviously has a benefit in terms of land usage and regeneration. Or looking at transitioning to bio-based materials. But again, these things are very early on in their development. We're also looking at moving the business model to a more circular business model, so looking at resale and rental opportunities. So we have a partnership now with Vestiaire Collective and My Wardrobe HQ, so you can rent a classic Burberry trench coat, for example, and we put that alongside our kind of aftercare services like refresh or repair services for coats and shoes, for example, keeping the products in use for longer. And so all of these things are happening and adding up, but what we have to do is really start from the lens of the product portfolio to understand how far and how fast we need to go in terms of decarbonisation to hit that top level target. And so by modelling the carbon footprint against our strategic 4-year plan, we can really ensure that those actions we're taking are closely linked to the business strategy, and that we're working on areas that are going to move us further towards decarbonisation of the product portfolio.
Great, thank you. Really interesting to hear that kind of oversight. And the product portfolio within Burberry is massive, and addressing all areas at once can be really challenging. So how did you kind of decide what to focus on within the product portfolio?
Well, I think compared to somewhere like Unilever, where you have a product of washing powder that has existed forever and will continue to exist, fashion is seasonal by nature. And so we are a creative-led luxury business. And so that means that we have new products every 3 or 4 months that maybe will be a different fabrication or something very new and unique through our runway collections. And those things will only live for a relatively short time. But we've also got a significant portion of our business, which is the core products, which live on for much longer. And so if we focus on the materials and the manufacturing for those core products, for example, a heritage trench coat or a cashmere scarf or a cotton shirt, we can have a much bigger impact because we know that the actions we're going to take are then going to be consistent over the life of those products. So one example we've had recently is we've relaunched our core Burberry check products called Burberry Classics. And what we've made sure as we've done that relaunch is that the main material of all of the items are either responsibly sourced or certified. And so that includes the shift to organic cotton or recycled nylon. And by investing in that product that will live much longer in terms of the shelf life of it and the longevity in the portfolio, we can make sure that we're pushing a bigger portion of our sales into those more sustainable materials. The next step was really to understand the carbon footprint of the materials and the manufacturing processes. So again, there's a lot of uncertainty in this area. It was interesting to hear Annabelle talk about it, but the kind of factors of emissions per kilo of different fibres can be very, very different and sometimes quite subjective. And so really making sure that we understand which categories are driving the biggest impact in terms of emissions is really important. And so I was able to work with our sustainability team, who are already looking at the historic footprint of the different emissions for the different categories. And so they already had a good understanding of the key materials that we need to focus on. And they also were able to share the current plans that they have in place to evolve that certain materials so that we could then focus our attention on those ones that were either going to go faster or that we already had that kind of plan in place. And then lastly, we consider the growth ambitions for the different product categories. So our strategy calls to bring all of our product categories to the full potential. Particularly that means for us a growth in accessories, so shoes and bags. And obviously the materials you're using in those products are quite different to in a trench coat or a shirt. So then by focusing on the impact of those areas, we can look to try and optimize the material and manufacturing choices to ensure that doesn't become a headwind towards us achieving our decarbonisation targets.
Great, thank you. It's really interesting to hear about the complexities of a kind of business that's rapidly changing and with different challenges than some of the other kind of real economy might find. And so with all of that work, how did you bring a financial lens to thinking about your product portfolios within the context of your decarbonisation strategy?
So as a finance team, we've already been working with the product teams to model the 4-year plan. And so we have quite a complex model that considers the volume growth, pricing, cost inflation, any investment, so that we could do rigorous financial planning. And so because we already had that, we were looking at different growth scenarios and looking at how we need to focus on driving cost efficiencies. And so we really just took that same process and model and then built the sustainability layer almost on top of it. So we built in any sustainability interventions that we knew we were having in terms of like using different materials or moving to organic cotton. And then using our knowledge of the products and the product evolution, we could really then feed into the carbon model, the growth assumptions, any changes, and also extrapolate beyond the kind of 4-year financial planning cycle to make sure that we were hitting the longer term horizons that you need when you're considering decarbonisation. And so that modelling really allowed us to understand the biggest drivers and also the gap to target if we continued with no changes. And so that again helps us to identify those areas where we should focus on. So we've already got a plan in place and we can see how much that's delivering. So what are the next areas that are going to drive that step change and that reduction that's helping us to reduce the footprint overall? And so that could be looking at a different category that we haven't considered previously, or it could be looking at a different manufacturing process, or it could be looking at wastage of materials around a certain manufacturing environment. And then also because we've been running scenarios around the 4-year plan in terms of growth rates and different investments, we also use those models to model different scenarios about the evolution of the carbon footprint as well. And also looked at if we decided to change things. So if, for example, today we have cotton dresses and tomorrow we have silk dresses, where we can look at the different factors of the different materials and understand how that drives the evolution of the carbon footprint for a specific category as well. And so really doing things like that, it helps you to have the conversation with the people that are actually working on sourcing the materials and developing the products. And just, I think also to Annabelle's point, bringing that very core level of understanding and just opening the conversation on some of these pieces, whereas maybe historically it hasn't been something that's been factored in terms of the thinking for product development.
Great, thank you. It sounds like a really interesting tool, and one I'm sure that a lot of the finance professionals in the audience would love to have a play around with to see how some of the kind of answers change. And how did you use your finance mindset to bring a strategic lens to support decision making? So there's obviously lots of areas where cost savings may arise as a result of kind of switches needed, but where some might not be as financially viable. How can you kind of use your finance mindset in those cases?
Well, I think one of the key challenges we have really is around timelines. So the business planning cycle is a 4-year view, but obviously we need to be modelling out much further. And so by bringing our kind of finance skill set, we can do scenario planning, we can think about how to make something credible, and we can really help to guide and kind of cross-check and sense-check work that's being done on a much longer time horizon. We've also got the challenge of lead time on new materials. So if we want to have investments now with partners, we might not see an industrially viable product for a number of years. And so making sure that when we're making our choices and trade-offs in terms of our budgeting, that we are understanding and incorporating those investments that we need to make now in order to deliver the longer term. So I know Annabelle also talked about having a separate fund, but we have the Burberry Regeneration Fund, where we've allocated funding to support some of the transitions, for example, to regenerative agriculture. And so we're working in partnership with a B Corp who's working with wool providers in Australia to promote regenerative farming practices. And on the one hand, you think, well, what's that got to do with the wool jumper that you're producing today? But this investment is not only helping us deliver the sustainability ambitions and supporting wider system change, it's also giving us continuity, so being able to ensure that we continue the supply of the materials at the quality that we need for a luxury brand into the future. And so I think it's partly around allocating some money that is almost protected from the short-term challenges, and it's also about thinking about the cost of not doing these things, particularly in terms of material availability, supply, and obviously the ability to hit the numbers. And I think another area where we've really looked at investing is around IT infrastructure processes. So, you know, we have a number of regulations in the textiles and fashion industry around extended producer responsibility and traceability. And so ensuring that we're investing in the support that we need in terms of data and information to be able to meet those requirements is really important. And that's another role that we play as finance, to make sure we're balancing the long term versus the short term, and that we will be ready to meet those requirements as and when they hit us as a business.
Yeah, really interesting point, and echoing Annabelle's comment on the kind of the cost of inaction, which becoming more of a consideration, I think, amongst a lot of corporates at the moment. So earlier on, you mentioned the trench coats and specific lines, but I wonder if there's one example that you could talk through in a bit more depth, just to kind of add a bit more flavour to some of the work that you've been doing.
Yeah, sure. So as a luxury business with a lot of different product categories, some of our products are bought from third-party vendors, but our trench coats are manufactured in Castleford in Yorkshire, and we have end-to-end supply chain control and visibility. And so it's been a great example of looking at the life of one product and saying, how can we really make sure that every step of the way we are making the right choices to make that product as sustainable and as low carbon as possible. And so the journey begins with the gabardine, which is the fabric that our founder Thomas Burberry invented. That's made from certified organic cotton, and it's spun. It's woven in Keighley in Yorkshire. Has a short journey to Castleford for the manufacturing process, and so obviously keeping everything as local as possible. We also use bio-based buttons to make sure that the buttons that go on the trench coat have the lowest possible carbon footprint. We employ more than 600 people across our manufacturing in Yorkshire, and so we're also really proud to be part of the Living Wage Foundation and to ensure that everybody has at least the living wage hourly rate. All of our processing of the fabrics are done using lower impact and finishing processes, so working with outsourced providers to make sure that we have the best possible sustainability footprint there, and also very focused on water usage in that process. And in terms of the kind of process that we're taking the coat through, there's a number of different processes all in-house, and over 300 tests and checks on quality to make sure that what we're producing is really a wonderful investment, long-lasting product. We've also worked across all of our sites on the energy, so we've made sure our facilities are energy efficient, and we use 100% renewable electricity sources. And then also we're using the expertise of our teams to offer reproofing and repair services. So there's a wonderful part of the factory where you can go, where they take your granny's old trench coat that maybe has had its lining out, and they lovingly basically reconstruct these garments, and so they can either because it's something that's very sentimental to you, or just obviously to extend the life of the product. So we're using the expertise and craftsmanship we have in-house to make sure that we can extend the life of the products wherever possible. And so I think really by looking across that whole chain, from how do we make the fabric, through the sewing processes, through the manufacturing sites that we use, and then out into the end of life care for the customer, it's a really great example of how we have to consider every single step of the process to try and drive sustainability into the product.
Yeah, great, thank you. It also kind of demonstrates the complexity just for one product. So, but also the benefits of maybe looking at small segments of the organization for those who are kind of just starting out and maybe starting with a pilot project before expanding it across the different categories. And so what are the key difficulties and challenges of the work that you've been doing on product portfolios?
So I think for me and for the finance team overall, the key challenge is really that balance between the kind of short-term demands and the longer-term strategic ambition. So fashion is very fast-paced. We have 4 collections a year. There's a lot of churn, a lot of change. We're always running towards a goal and a deadline. And so finding the time to kind of step back and focus and to really consider these longer-term initiatives can be really challenging. And I think actually by linking it to the kind of annual strategic planning cycle, it's great because it then forces you to stop and consider this as part of an existing process that's already there. I think also challenging is the number of people that are required to make a step change. So I talked about it briefly, but leaning back into the people that we're partnering with. So designers, product developers, fabric people, procurement people, sourcing people who are working across our supply chain. There's a very wide group of people that you need to influence, and perhaps it hasn't traditionally been something that they needed to think about as part of their day-to-day. And so we've got a lot of great communication that happens across the business broadly about our sustainability journey, but we've also now got a group of sustainability champions. And so there's a network of these champions across the business so that they can, really understand from the experts in the business what's happening and take that back into their areas. So we've really been piggybacking off that. And then I think bringing examples, bringing choices. So the work that we did on the modelling, just if you go to somebody and you say this material is good and this one is bad, then it's not particularly helpful. Whereas if you say, if you moved X percentage of your portfolio to this, the impact would be Y, I think that then sparks conversation about making the right choices. So it's just really about finding the right ways to communicate with the teams and kind of bring these examples to life. And then I think finally for me, a big learning was how much had already been done that I as a finance person didn't know about. So I set off thinking I was going to have to create this big model and big plan, and I found out the sustainability team were already doing it. So actually a lot of what I've been doing is really partnering with people who are the experts and then thinking about how can I amplify that through my role in the business and the people that I partner with, to make sure that that work is really tangible and considered and is living and breathing and having an impact in the business.
Great, thank you. Some really important top tips there, I think would be very helpful for our audience. Thank you so much, Lizzy, for your comments. If you're interested in finding out more about these areas, I'd recommend reading the A4S Essential Guide to Strategic Planning, Budgeting and Forecasting. So there's lots of good examples and further explanations in there, and it's a really helpful guide if you're starting out or progressing on your journey, and we'll share the links into the chat. For the first question, and maybe we ask Annabelle first, how would you say that your governance structure supports your approach to sustainability?
Sorry,
And to embed?
did you
How
say
does your
governance?
your governance structure, and how does it kind of support with embedding sustainability within those strategic planning, budgeting and forecasting processes?
Yeah, I mean, we our governance structure in terms of we have the board, we have a specific corporate responsibility committee that looks at sustainability in detail. So we have a number of board groups, I guess, who are sitting across the sustainability agenda. But then we also have strategic targets for leadership and senior management that are in place. So performance incentive targets that are linked to sustainability initiatives. So there are a number of things across the organisation to make sure that everybody's aligned with the same targets. Our quarterly performance management process, if you like, is run through managing OKRs, and that includes the sustainability OKRs. So that all ladders up to overall performance and how we reward people in the organisation.
Great, thank you. Maybe for Lizzy, what would you say are the kind of business benefits of incorporating sustainability into strategic planning, budgeting, and forecasting processes?
So I think there's a piece around making sure that you're aligning everything you're doing in the sustainability agenda with your product or strategic business agenda. So, making sure that if you have a very ambitious target on materials, that is aligned to where the business is going. I think also, there's increasing pressure on all sorts of businesses to demonstrate that they are really tangibly moving, and it is important to consumers. So we always have to keep an eye on where are we, versus some of our luxury peers in terms of the claims and the commitment to sustainability. I think we're quite lucky that compared to maybe very low margin businesses, a little bit more scope to be able to invest. But so I think it's really about making sure that the efforts that you're putting in for sustainability are aligned and working in the same direction and not at any odds with where you're trying to drive your business strategy overall.
Great, thank you. And maybe just a final comment from both of you on just the importance of the finance team in kind of delivering this and embedding sustainability throughout these processes. Maybe if we start with Annabelle.
Well, I mean, I think it's the same point that Lizzy raised, in that there are great teams all over the business doing good work and are frankly the experts in this area. I think what finance does well is bring all of those people together and help them build a strategic plan and a structured plan, if you like, to deliver this, and then continue to help with the performance management of it. So I think finance people have a lot of value to add in the process and can help some of the experts, all work together and get aligned.
Yeah, great, thank you. Lizzy, anything to add?
I think as finance, across the finance function, we've got obviously the kind of corporate finance people, and within there we've built a small team of experts who are really looking at some of these pieces in terms of the reporting, regulation, and sustainability. So we were able to build that expertise team, but then there's a number of different finance business partners, so we probably cover all of the organization in one way or another. So we have that seat at the table and we have that ability to influence. And my role as a finance partner is to understand where my functions are driving and sort of support and challenge them to meet their agenda. So it's very natural to me to be able to then support and challenge in this space as well. And I think the other thing for finance professionals is, it's such an emerging important topic. So I know in Burberry, the year before I did the academy, there was a cohort that were also on the academy, and they set up this lovely series of events where there were kind of 30-minute sustainability for finance webinars, and we all got quite excited and evangelical about the topic and went off and told everybody. And so I think if you can really garner the enthusiasm and energy of your finance team, you can get very widely across the business very quickly.
Great, thank you. Fantastic insights. And thank you so much for your discussions today. It's been really helpful for our audience. So I'm just going to hand back to Taryn, but thank you so much again, and I'm looking forward to speaking to you shortly.
Thanks, Helen. And thank you so much to our panelists for their contributions today. If anyone is interested in finding out more on the topic, we do have a range of resources available on our website, which, as mentioned previously, include the A4S Essential Guide to Strategic Planning, Budgeting and Forecasting. We also have case studies from SSE, Yorkshire Water and Royal DSM. We have a Strategic Planning, Budgeting and Forecasting Maturity Map, so you can assess where your organisation lies in terms of maturity. We have a blog on practical approaches for bringing sustainability into financial planning, and a video on top tips for embedding sustainability into SP, B and F. And links for all of these are now being shared in the chat function. And yeah, thank you so much for joining the discussion, and thank you again to our guests, Annabelle and Lizzy. If you haven't already registered, our reporting webinar is taking place on the 31st of July, and the link to register is now being shared in the chat as well. We look forward to seeing you at the next session.